Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, which is the fourth webinar in our series 5. I'll let you know about the fifth one that's coming up in a couple of weeks at the end. All about HR tech for scale-ups. And particularly, we've been discussing everything to do with how you choose the right tech for your culture and your people experience. So great to have those of you that are here live. We've got a few on the line today, and also those of you watching on the recording. Hopefully we're going to have a great conversation to share with you today. Those of you that don't know me, I'm Bea. I am one of the co-founders of The Pioneers. At The Pioneers, we're focused on helping founders and leaders to create a culture that they can be really proud of. I am really excited about today's webinar topic, all about how you think through the user experience principles when you are selecting or implementing new HR tech in your business. And before we get started, firstly, an apology. You will notice that I only have one guest on the screen here with me. So Ozzy, who was going to be joining us, has been struck down by the dreaded lurgy. He let us know a couple of days ago he'd got COVID, and sadly he's feeling pretty rotten today. So didn't want to bring, even though we are virtual, he would just be coughing his whole way through the session. So sadly he's cried off sick, but we'll have him on a future webinar, hopefully, so you'll be able to hear from him then. I am, though, joined by the lovely Elisa Mirkil, and she will give a little introduction to herself.
Hi.
Now.
Yeah, sorry to be here all by myself, but I'm excited for this conversation. I'm Elisa Mirkil. I'm a UX UI designer focused on B2B enterprise software. I work primarily these days with early stage product startups, so kind of new products that are coming on the market as often the first designer. So kind of joining founding teams as the person who's going to kind of pull the direction towards the product design, away from the engineering and away from just the commercial, because I think that's really where the best kind of innovation happens, is when you've got these strong pulls. But I do come from a more big tech perspective of having worked at SAP as a consultant, designing custom UX UI solutions. And yeah, really excited to talk about HR tech today.
And so great, the perfect person, I think, for us to be speaking to about user experience then. Maybe a good place for us to start is, why are we even addressing this question about user experience and user experience principles? Why does it matter? Why do we need to think beyond kind of the functionality of HR tech? So yeah, in your experience, why is user experience so important?
Well, I mean, the effectiveness of a technology is only possible if people actually use it. And user experience design is sort of your main lever for making sure that it is usable and kind of delivering value. I think, when you're thinking from an engineering perspective, or when you're thinking about just from an operational perspective, it's really easy to get lost in sort of, what are we trying to achieve? What does the business need? What's kind of messy and needs to be sorted out. But then if you do that without an eye towards how people actually work and what people would like to use, it's not, unfortunately, you will not realize your dreams. So it's really important that we put user experience at the forefront. And I think in HR, which is such it has so many different roles in an organization, and from sort of the very banal to the most lofty of goals, that it's really important that user experience is sort of driving that, driving it to achieve all of that myriad of goals that it has.
Yeah, and I think we'll come on to talk about those a bit later, but there is this kind of the stuff that you just need to get done, the admin burden, and how you can maybe design systems that are almost invisible versus the stuff that you really want to happen, and maybe the systems need to be far more engaging and prompting of particular behaviors in the real world, if you like, that you want to see. So I'm sure we'll come on to that. But maybe, do you have a personal experience, maybe in something that you've consulted on, or maybe a company that you've worked in, that demonstrates well when maybe it's gone wrong, where the user experience hasn't been part of it hasn't been well thought through, and therefore what people hoped to happen with that technology just didn't happen.
I think you see it more often than not, unfortunately. I think especially, I think, things are getting a lot better, but I do think that in enterprise tech, it's always been sort of the last thing to get on board user experience. So, I mean, that's the question is like, would you rather someone use a product or use an interface that is absolutely infuriating and so they like stop, which I've seen that before, right? Like if it's sort of I can't get this thing to do what I need it to, so I'm gonna just put it off and put it off and put it off until it becomes a problem and someone's actually yelling at me to do it. That's one version of like bad. Other versions of bad that I think almost break my heart more is when people get good at using bad interfaces. So like they understand that a field doesn't actually mean anything, but just needs to be filled out, or like they've learned how to learn like, labels or categorizations that the software is using that actually make no sense, but they've like learned how to use it.
They've created a hack. Yeah, I think there's when you find that employees have created a hack to get around a system issue, so they're still using it, but maybe not in the way that was originally intended. Actually, the risk for me in that situation is you get this key man issue where you've got this institutional knowledge for how systems work sat with particular people, and there's probably no documentation around how they've made the system work in that situation. They've just pushed their way through. And actually, when people walk out the door, they take those knowledge and that work around. And it was actually all because the user experience was poor in the first
totally
place.
Like if I'm actually in the designer's seat of these things, like when I find out that someone's hacked it, that's like a very exciting moment because they've picked up on something that's not working for them, or they wish it was doing something more or not. And it's really about then going to that person who did that and understanding what they were trying to achieve, because it can actually be like one of the most valuable insights that you get because like shutting it down is not good, because that's obviously like you're shutting down the solution to the problem. Even if the hack at first is kind of like scary, it's kind of part of this experimentation thing that you really need to focus on. That like then I put on my user research hat and I say like, okay, what really was the problem? What really are you trying to solve? Why is this better than what it was before? But you have to do that quickly so that you can actually then integrate it to the product or integrate it to the system, rather than sort of say like, this is an exception and then it disappears and you never actually fix the thing that was broken.
Yeah, or people live with that for a really long time and it just becomes embedded into
it becomes critical
using the system. Yeah. So then maybe still in setup, the next thing I just want to explore when we talk about user experience, I think we have quite a few different audiences that we're thinking about, particularly in the HR tech space. So we have employees as users, a subset of which I would say also is the manager population who interact with HR tech systems, often in quite different ways to maybe your frontline employees. And then you've also got HR teams who clearly are often the purchasers of these kinds of tech systems and have often got quite a different need from the system as well. I mean, wearing your designer hat maybe, but also just past experience, which group matters more, or how might you sort of articulate the different needs of those different groups, and does one matter more?
So one matters more if you're trying to sell, like if you're selling the product, one matters more because whoever's buying it matters more, which leads us to that kind of vicious cycle of like the user experience isn't great because the person who's buying it doesn't actually have to use it every day or in the way that it mainly is going to be used. I don't think you can say that one necessarily matters more than the other, because you wouldn't need the system if you didn't have HR. Like HR is there to sort of, the people operation, the fact that there is an operation going on is why you need this software. But the one thing that unites everyone is that they are also an employee. So like everyone has to use the software as an employee at the end of the day. But that's, as your employee, you have the least sort of interest in the system at large. You sort of want it to be like, can I do this one thing I need to do? Can it get done? And like, arguably, you don't need a system to do those things, right? Like if it was just you and me, I could just be like, hey, B, I'm doing this, like, see you later. And email would suffice. But the second you need to build a system, that's where these sort of tensions arise, that you do have different stakeholders with different priorities, and they are going to impact each other. But no doubt, if the employee experience isn't good, you're dead on arrival.
Nobody's going to use it. Just going back to that point then about which matters more, if you're selling the technology, making it do everything that you're being asked of by the people ops or the HR team. If you're somebody sat listening to our conversation now, my hope is that actually you're somebody working in the people space who is comfortable challenging that traditional perspective, and actually is wearing the user experience hat of how my employee is going to experience this. What are some of the things that maybe then you want to look out for to avoid maybe falling in some of your own biases that would mean that you'd select HR tech that looks great from a people ops team perspective, but isn't necessarily going to service the needs of your employees? Like how can you do a better job of wearing the employee experience hat when you're making these sorts of choices?
I mean, I think so there's two sides. I definitely think, I am biased towards a system. Like, there's a reason I like designing for these types of things, which I think is the system does matter. And like, I do think that should still be a really leading part of the decision-making process. Like, it needs to work on the back end. It needs to work on how this organization needs it to work. Because in a way, you would hope that, I think in general, it is easier to change the employee experience on the front end a little bit more. It's easier to sort of change screens or, create new inputs into the system rather than sort of trying to create like a fantastic, because I'm very skeptical of products that are just like really good looking. I have to say, like, there's a part of me that says, like, why is this so good looking? What are you trying to hide? There's definitely a balancing act there. But I think in terms of like, to make sure that you are not being biased, understanding that you are biased, like understanding, like I just said, I am biased towards the system in some ways. My job when I'm in a product team is to not be that way, or to, put that aside. And the way that I would do that is, you first and foremost, you have to go to your users. And the best thing about being in sort of within SaaS or within an organization is, those users. Like, there's not, you're not designing for a hypothetical, sort of marketing ideal of a customer. You're actually designing for like someone or someone you can access quite quickly. And I think to use that resource, that person is waiting for you. That person will talk to you. And so many others in your team have been on other teams that have used products that have worked and not worked. So like, really leveraging that organizational knowledge that you have is one really key way, I think, of making sure that you don't try and get something that people are going to hate you for, or hate using, or not use. I think that's always the best. But then, having a plan for how to experiment, how to change the inputs, the interfaces that users have right off the bat. I think that is actually one of the more easy things to do, to change as you go. So being open and being interested in experimentation, I think, are really important.
So if I sort of play some of that back, I think there is a functional checklist almost that you want to walk into any purchasing decision with. And that's important, because otherwise you risk being persuaded by bells and whistles that perhaps aren't underpinned by proper system integrations and those sorts of things that do matter. We're not here to say that it is just about the sort of the shiny user experience. But on top of that, you then need to get a really good understanding of your user. Like, what do they actually need from the technology? And both functionally and from an experience point of view as well? Like how do they want that to feel? Like that's the sort of probably the pre-work that you want to do before you're making any decisions about what to buy. Is that sort of a fair reflection?
Yeah, you definitely want to, I think that's an excellent reflection. And I do think, yeah, it's about sort of having that in mind first as much as you can. And then as the process goes, maybe you have a key group of people you can keep going back to that are sort of have a vested interest in the fact that they will end up using it, but aren't involved in the actual like HR function, weighing in and saying like, what, this doesn't make any sense to me because I don't understand what you're trying to do, like using that sort of fresh perspective as much as you can throughout the process. I think that's the thing with technology purchases and technology implementation is like, it's very rarely like click and done. It's very iterative. Yeah. And so, kind of embracing that iterative process and bringing people in to try things or to, weigh in.
And maybe so a couple of things I'd like to explore, this role of the managers, but also the scale of a business and how that might affect this iterative process. So I think most people on the line will be from sort of smaller companies that are somewhere between 25 and 150 people. Now we may well also have some who are in sort of larger enterprises, but there's challenges in both worlds, right, around testing tech. In terms of the smaller you are, probably the easier it is to get your hands around all your employees and maybe be quite agile in terms of switching between systems or testing a few out at once. The larger that you are, the easier it is to create a cohort who might be able to test in a bit of a sandbox for a while before actually releasing anything that's maybe going to affect what you're actually doing as a business or the systems that you're actually using. Would you have different advice for different sizes of companies and how to approach this idea of testing your HR tech and taking quite an iterative approach to developing the user experience?
Not necessarily. I think it is sort of a universal goal to have this, right? And to use whenever possible design thinking methodologies that do sort of become participatory. I think what happens is more the system side of it is so much more pronounced in a larger enterprise than sort of in a smaller enterprise, perhaps, that like it needs to do 150 things rather than like 5 things, or it needs to be built for this specific company, like we're building it custom, but all of regardless, it should be gone through sort of a testing function. You should be like, I used to work with large companies all the time, and having access to user was still pretty easy because again, they work for a company, they're there, they have a vested interest, like people will know them, people will find them. And I think just having that group or having that changing group of people that can sort of, that you can access, like it doesn't matter, it's the whole, like if you walk down, in the traditional sense, if you walk down a hallway, like you could just ask random people, like, what do you think of this? Or how do you do this? And I don't think we should be afraid of doing that. I would say though, like I also would be very afraid, no matter what size business, I mean, okay, let's say maybe larger than 15 people, of like a consensus driven model. Like I do think, consensus, sort of, you're getting into a political game there, right? Of like, what's good for somebody, what's not good for someone else, and trying to get everyone to agree. Totally admirable, likely impossible. And this is sort of what user, persona making and user research and this sort of thing is about. It's good to know that there are people who are maybe not going to agree with the choices that you're making or going to have reservations about it so that you can address them. But, I don't think it has to be sort of shopping by 20 people to agree on,
every last detail of what the
I think it's better to, I think you
Yeah.
have to give up on this idea that you're going to buy the perfect thing and it's going to work perfectly. Like it doesn't work that way. I'm sorry to say, like, no matter what.
I just want to jump into, we've been asked a question by Sarah about so I think I referenced having a kind of functional checklist when you're looking to buy a new piece of HR tech. And she asks, is there a universal base of things to have in mind? Which my immediate reflection on that would be, well, not necessarily. It depends, I think, if you're buying, maybe your first HRIS system for managing employee data, and then there would be like a list of things that you definitely want your HRIS system to do for you. Like it needs to store unique records of employees. You need to be able to put the start dates in, salaries, contact details. So, those sort of, like, it needs to, there's basic things you would need an HRIS to do, but you would have a different checklist if you're looking to purchase tech to achieve a different outcome. So one of the amazing things in the HR tech space now is the last 10, 15 years, maybe less actually, we've seen an explosion in terms of the number of different tools that you could potentially buy, and the nicheness of some of those tools as well. So you might be just looking to buy something that helps people to book office space. If you've moved to a more of a hybrid model and you've got fewer desks, well, you might be looking to buy a piece of tech that supports tracking people's holiday, or it could be something around personal development, managing one-to-ones, those sorts of things. And depending on what you are trying to achieve with the tech, would create a different functional checklist. That would be my thought on that. So I can't say, oh, this is the universal list you should always have in mind when looking to make new purchases. So, but Elisa, would you add anything to that in response to that question?
I mean, I totally agree that it's not there. Unfortunately, if there were a universal thing, there would be a one product solution for everybody, and that's definitely not.
Which SAP sometimes tries to be, right?
For sure. No, like the big ones have, I mean, because they have to have sort of everything in one, you need this perfect integration. But I mean, again, there's a reason that that's sort of the most mature software you can get. Like you've done it for 20 or 30 years one way, and you need to kind of keep doing it that way, or whatever. Versus, I think what you were just saying, I'm like flabbergasted by how many different solutions there are. Like it's impossible to even know what's on the market to some degree, because it's constantly changing and growing. And but I think that's also really liberating, especially if you are sort of starting out. Like if you sort of saying like, we've reached the max of what we were doing. Like that's really what it is, right? I've reached whatever analog slapstick solution I have, like that's sort of just pulling things together, isn't going to work anymore. Like that's a great place to start to try and solve that first problem. And then you're into an ecosystem, and I guarantee no matter how big or small the products you're using are relying on their ability to connect to other systems and things. So like definitely don't boil the ocean on these things. Like really stick to one use case at a time, defining it really clearly, defining the needs there, defining all the different types of users that are going to have to access it. And then from there, you can kind of keep going and adding as you need to. But if you're trying to say like, I need to digitize HR now, like you better have a good sense of what HR is then, and like exactly what it's doing before you try and automate or digitize it. I think that's a big challenge.
I think that's really good advice in terms of. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It is difficult navigating this stuff. But I think that is really good advice, at least around maybe the place to start is where the current way of working is reaching breaking point. So I've had conversations with people where they're like, oh, we want to do it right first time, which is great. But it is very difficult to predict the needs of your system over time. Like there are particular moments in the growth of a startup and a scaling business where you can have a reasonable idea that you're going to need some kind of HRIS system once you reach 15, 20 employees or something about that, where you can have a Google Sheet or something like that. But like you probably is reaching a point where just keeping track of this data and onboarding and offboarding people is going to be easier if you have a basic HRIS system. But you'll know that because you're managing the process manually now, and it's starting to just eat up too much of your time. And I think back to sort of the prep conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about this idea of just being really careful that you don't go to the market with a wish list that then means that your choices are led by what the technology can do rather than by the needs of the people in your business right now. I think that's a really helpful way of thinking when you're thinking about the user experience. What's currently broken or what's currently causing tensions, work that out so that you can get clear on how you want to change that experience, and then you can find the technology that fits that hole.
Absolutely.
Is that how you remember our pre-conversation?
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, there are so many exciting products out there. It's hard to understand what is going on with them, or like where they kind of begin and end, and what they can do and what they can. And I definitely think that the more grounded you can be in that decision-making process, and I see this as a designer too, like having a user to me is like the most liberating thing, to have another person I can go to and be like, what do you think of this? So they can tell me if I'm like, on track or off track, like finding someone who can really ground me back into like, what are we actually trying to solve? For whom are we trying to solve this? And like often the solution is simpler than you think the second you try and start solving it. Or even as a designer, the second I start designing, you're tempted to kind of go bigger, and then you realize actually it didn't need to go bigger. It can be parsed back.
And I think the simplest thing, it can just be literally have one of your users sat alongside you, and even if it's just one, if you're a small business, as you're going through some of these purchasing decisions, that can help make sure that you've got the right things in mind when you're or somebody at least to challenge.
I was gonna say, make sure you don't pick like your best friend who's gonna be afraid of hurting your feelings. Like definitely pick someone who's not afraid to tell you what they think, because that's gonna serve you so much better.
And where you do know you've got quite different user groups, then you'll want to either do a slightly more formal process of understanding user needs, or make sure you've got representatives from different groups, not to get to your point, not to get to a consensus, but just to make sure that you have got insight into the different potential needs.
The trade-offs. Yeah.
I want to come back to this point about managers, because I think this is from a user experience point of view, managers can often be pinch points in using HR tech. So there is no world in which companies operate there are always human beings in the system, right? We're not sort of perfect automatons in using these kind of HR tech systems, and more often than not, systems are there to nudge behaviors that happen in real life. Managers are often a group that need to take action outside of the system in order to make sure that what you're trying to achieve with it actually happens. How do we look after this group, or what are some of the challenges or points of tension that you've noticed that come up for managers in HR tech?
I mean, I think managers, there's a reason that there's such like a linchpin of organizations broadly, right? They kind of are the glue of all the things that kind of have to come together. And in technology, that's even more true a lot of the time, because there are, especially in HR systems that have sort of proprietary, like important private information, like there is only one person that can put that in, or there is like, these different roles, which is unique, I think, in the HR tech space a bit more than other sorts of systems, where you don't have this kind of intermediary perhaps, or you don't have this person who like might have a role that is to do something extra in the HR system, but they're not actually in HR, and like they're not actually the employee. Like they have, defining where they do need to hit the system as a manager is really important. When does that need to happen? And then how can that happen most effectively? Because yeah, it's usually kind of in these sort of unusual use cases, perhaps, you know, in like the onboarding, offboarding, raises, things of that nature, perhaps in leave, if depending on how your business is oriented. And that's part of their job description. But I think I was once talking to someone who's a teacher, and they were talking about, you know, I'm a teacher because I like teaching, but the schools that I keep working in keep giving me more technology. So I feel like my time is now all about technology, when really, and I mean, obviously this became even more important during COVID, like when I really was here to sort of teach students a content that I know. And I think that's a really good parallel for thinking about an HR manager user. They're not there because they want to use the system. They're there because they have a certain job description that like requires them to also use the system. Yeah.
Yeah, so the point I would pick up on that is almost from the other side. So some of my experience working with managers in organizations and trying to nudge better.
Yes,
can you hear me? Oh, it's just my screen that's frozen. So working with managers in trying to encourage the right kinds of management behaviors. And I think one of the risks with introducing technology into that manager-employee relationship is actually it can sometimes make it easier for a manager to hide behind the technology. So the teacher scenario, people go into teaching because they want to spend, in the main, making assumptions here, but they want to spend that face time with kids in a classroom, and like that is the main role. People don't go into people management for the same reasons. Often it was the next stage that they had to take in a career progression. There's no other means of progressing through an organization. So it's far more common, I think, in manager populations to find people in roles where they're not necessarily got a burning desire to spend more time doing the people management activity. So when you put technology on the table and you call that people management, like you need to manage people's holiday, you need to have a one-to-one conversation and make sure that you record the inputs and the outputs of that conversation in this piece of software. And you can I think you can sometimes provide an excuse to almost dehumanize some of that manager-employee relationship if you're not careful with the way that HR tech is implemented. And again, I think that comes back to this, don't be led by what the technology can do. Be clear on what the behaviors are that you're trying to drive, and then how do you find technology that's most likely to nudge those behaviors in the right direction. And sometimes, particularly if we're looking outside of HRIS, but we're looking at personal development platforms and those, or learning platforms, those sorts of spaces, we're really trying to use them to nudge. It's actually all about the human behaviors that matters. The technology's there to just provide that light touch. And if it's over-engineered, it can kind of be counterproductive, I think, sometimes.
I definitely. No, I totally agree. And I think it's a really important distinction. I would say, I think that, yeah, I mean, it's a difficult, because you can't change people through technology very much, you know, like people are people. And so like, I do believe that you can nudge behavior, but like the second you turn something into a system, you're turning it into a checklist, which I think you highlight really well. That's the risk, is that like actually being a manager has become these 5 tasks that I complete on a weekly basis. And like, I'm a manager, you know, and that's my job, is to complete these 5 tasks. And so I do think that would be a good example, though, of like, you know, technology is always going to think that way. I mean, most of the time it's about turning an idea into a like bite-sized task or like an input. And it's not bad that it does that. It can be really like, it becomes self-fulfilling. It will create the behaviors that you want, but it is at the end of the day like a task. And I do think finding that opportunity to say, this isn't a technology problem, like this isn't, you know, this isn't something we can change by like implementing a new system. Like I think that in terms of a wish list, like if you're trying to sort of change your culture through buying software, like we know that's not going to work. So it is a tricky balance for sure. And I think a really important one in HR, more so than in so many other places where like you're talking about people, you're talking about systems, and you're trying to figure out which one is which.
Yeah. Which brings me, sort of takes us into the next area of conversation that I wanted to look at, which is like, how do we identify which elements of our employee experience should be kind of in stream, if you like? So the you want to use technology to create nudges within Slack or Teams or an email, and which elements should be like a place you go to do something. I think we talked about the visible versus the invisible, and the benefit of the technology that we've got available to us now is that we can create these in stream. You know, you don't need to create a login to a separate platform for everything that you might ever want to do in the HR operations space or the people operations space. But it does leave us, then it does mean we have to make these choices about what warrants a whole platform and a special place to go, and what warrants this slick ease. And so how would we make choices about that, do you think?
Yeah, it's a challenging one, I think, because you know, at Instinct, you want to say, you know, the more you can be in the platforms that people are comfortable and happy using, the better. I mean, the more you can sort of, this is why sort of, you know, basic communication platforms are still so important to us, is because like they are sort of flexible and can do so many things. And we can integrate things into them. So I think it's important whenever it's possible to be in stream, it should be. That said, I mean, there's a limit, right? Like you don't want to make Slack, or I mean, even just email or Teams or whatever, you don't want to make this sort of this like clunky software, right? Like you could turn it into clunky software just by sort of adding new functionalities into it. But it's tricky because the second you're on another platform, you're on another site, you're on another software, that's huge friction for someone to go and use it. And I think we talked about the invisible and visible thing is like, as a designer, I would say, like, do you want them to be in a specific mindset when they're entering into this process, or do you want them to feel like this is business as usual, you know, check, I need to do this one thing and I'm not going to think about it. Like, I think this is why, you know, so there's no good answer, unfortunately. Like, I can't say like there's, you know, in certain use cases this, in certain use cases that. I think you just need to be, very conscious of how is this going to hit someone every day. If you're putting it in Slack, for example, is it going to be reminding them every day or something, or is it going to get lost in the shuffle, versus, you know, something that's kind of an isolated experience, but, you know, you go there, you get everything done, and then you come back to business as usual.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if I were to put a designer hat on, I think through some design thinking principles, there is huge value, I think, in that journey mapping exercise. So if you think that if there's a particular behavior or use case that you're exploring, whether tech might be part of the solution, you really want to map out what you want that employee experience to be through that process, so that you can identify, well, what is the mindset that we want them to be in? And actually, is this a moment where we want people to choose actively to go and do something because that will put them in a better frame of mind? Or is it a situation where we want to nudge the behavior at the right moment in time because we know that something's happening for that employee at that point in time? So think of specific examples, but if you've got somebody who's just been promoted to a manager, you may want to construct a situation where they actively choose to go and find the right training for them before they have their first team meeting or something like that. Or you might just know that their first team meeting's happening on this day, so you can land in their inbox or in their Slack feed an appropriate piece of training material that they received just at the right moment in time. In one scenario, they've actively made a choice to go and seek that out, and that might mean that they engage with something more, and there's more agency over that. But in the other scenario, you might have taken that choice away, but you've made it far more likely that they'll see the material at the right point in time. So it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's just you want to think about these things, and recognize that the choices that you do make in the way that you architect your technology they can create quite different experiences for your people, and that's just a choice that you want to think about making. I
do think when we were talking about managers earlier, like, again, it might make sense for a manager to do this sort of out of stream, or like, you know, in a specific platform, because it is sort of a functional part of their job. Like, this is part of what you do every day or every week, so like, go do it here, versus to an employee where it's sort of this thing I have to do, or, you know, like, the more kind of invested you are in the solution, the more work you're doing with it, kind of the more it makes sense to have a space for it, versus like, you know, if it's a requesting leave in a kind of slapdag, like, here we go, let's do it, like, I'm going away for a week, versus, you know, kind of higher order investment.
Yeah, and the same with, I mean, some of the things that come to mind for those in-stream, make it as easy as possible. It's not you just want to take the burden away, is, you know, particularly in that onboarding phase, you can get contracts signed, and that, like, they need to happen in a timely fashion. You just need to make it as easy as possible for people to do that, so that you're not creating delays for candidates, for managers, those sorts of things. So there are definitely elements of your employee experience which almost they are more valuable if they are invisible.
Absolutely. They're but that's always, like, also, I think we talked about this before, like, that's a choice that you're making to say, like, this is sort of one of those burdensome parts of HR tech, let's say, and then there are these sort of more important parts of HR tech, and just being very aware of those decisions and what they imply about the importance of something, I think, is really important when you're introducing technology to a process, because it's sort of like, would you want technology like driving your one-on-one conversation? Probably not. You might want it to, like you said, support it. Because if you were suddenly like, oh no, well, one-on-ones are actually just like filling out a form now, like, that's sort of a key distinguishing, like, oh, okay, that's what this means. So you're making choices about that, and I think it's really important to empathize with your user about how they value it, but then also think about how your organization values it, and what that balance is.
And so, thinking through some of these choices that you should be deliberately making as a purchaser, as an HR tech, or somebody that's got a role in implementing that in your company, how do you think people can go about creating a user experience that reflects their distinctive company culture? So it's not just good, like, we've thought about the user experience, like we're making deliberate choices, but how do we do that in a way that's distinctive to us, not just generic to what any other scaling business might do with HR tech? What are some of what advice would you have for people?
Well, I think it's kind of leading off that last point I was saying, is like, you have choices, you're making choices about your priorities just by, you know, buying software. I mean, you are sort of saying this is a problem, or this is something that's important enough that we're buying software, but it's also going to be solved by a technology solution rather than like a cultural or an organizational solution, or a new role or something like that. So I think it's, you know, to balance those two things is just to understand that you're always making these decisions within a cultural context, first of all, like, and you can kind of replicate culture without even thinking about it into your technology purchases. Again, is technology the leading way you want to change culture? No, like, do not try and change culture by buying software. It will not succeed. I can tell you that right now. So I do think it's just about sort of understanding what you are representing, understanding your own bias, either as the purchaser, as an HR person, or as, you know, or a tech person. And then, yeah, I think making clear distinctions about why are we using technology to solve this problem versus, you know, a different option that is in the real world, like, or, you know, an analog solution that could address some of these concerns.
Yeah. So if I may, I think some of the things, if I think about this question of how you make choices that reflect your distinctive company culture, I think there's this need to be clear on the kind of culture you're trying to create. So before you're trying to change anything to do with your people experience, do you have a clear idea of how like the tone of voice and the expression of your people experience, like how you want that to show up? You know, are you more of a professional company or more of a casual, cheeky tone of voice? Are you a place where you want to have a reasonable degree of centralized control and standardization around the way people work? Or are you a company that's much more supportive of, you know, lots of different ways of working and and servicing? You're quite happy to have multiple different processes and different stuff being surfaced from the front line? Are you a place that is high touch, human, or slick, more automation, efficient? And again, there are no right or wrong answers to these, but taking the time to think through like where you would like to take your culture, what's the culture you're aiming for, that will make it easier to frame some of the checklists or the decisions that you're then looking to make when you do purchase new technology or you do implement new technology, and also what you look for in terms of whether it's a success or not. Like, it may not be a success if things are being used. It may not just be the amount it's being used that is a determinant of whether it's a success or not. It's how it's being used that I think is probably where I would look to see if it was being successful or not. So yeah, that would just be my sort of if I was trying to address that. Get clear first on yeah. Okay. 10 minutes, right? There's one last area that I just want to touch on before we sort of do final closing thoughts. Just quickly to say, if anybody does have questions in the audience, please do post them in the chat. We will get to them. Thank you, Sarah, for your question earlier. We may have a few minutes to address them, so do fire away if you have any. But the last area for discussion, Elisa, I was keen to pick up on is just this issue of we've talked a lot about HR tech products, and that's easy to do in today's environment because there are so many of them. But we started the conversation, which is where I think your heart lies, which is thinking about this from a system perspective and not just an individual product. Why does that matter? Why should we have a system hat on as often as not as wearing a sort of a product hat, like we're making a choice about one function?
Yeah, I mean, from the like basics of why do we, I think you can always talk about, I think it's common knowledge that like apps on your phone, like on the average person's phone, like they really only use like 4 apps regularly, or, like maybe it's like 6 apps, like, and that's like, in your whole life is on this phone and you're going to use just like 4 of the 6. And I think it's the same if you're approaching this sort of from a like product standpoint. Like there is a threshold where people will forget that that there is elsewhere, there are other things going on, and that there is a solution for something that you've purchased, but it's not going to ever register. So I think that's the first thing about like why you should look at this more as like a system, is because you are really like giving people a handful of tools and they only have so much that they can give you back. I think from it, like when we talk about systems, I think we like to talk about them as sort of as if they are technological, or as if they're like this purely technological perspective, and systems are never that. Like systems are totally a human concept, right? Of like a way of understanding what's going on. and they always have humans involved, which we talked about earlier. So I think understanding that you are sort of, your organization is a large group of people with a lot of different functions that you're sort of trying to manage. Your individual contributors are part of that system. And so it doesn't make sense to sort of think about it completely from like one function. They do all have to work together. And, you know, like we were talking about, I come from like the big kind of argument at SAP was that you need just one and you don't need to go do everything else. I've listened to great webinars from you guys before where it's like, yeah, but they end up doing, you know, like 80% what you don't want, maybe 10% what you do. And like, that's totally a fair critique. So how you approach having it all is definitely a challenge, that, again, there's not an easy answer, but it is an important consideration.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in today's world, and this is drawing on some of the conversation from the previous webinar that I hosted, it's not to say that you don't want to, like, the individual products do matter, but the user experience will be affected by the whole system. So it kind of doesn't matter how good an individual user experience is in one system. To your point, you will have several systems, almost certainly, in today's world, particularly actually if you're in a smaller growing business, because you've got the ability to buy some very cheap platforms to solve the different problems that you might face. But the advantage today is they do integrate with each other. Generally speaking, there are good APIs now between different systems, and that's what you also want to be thinking about. How do you connect the systems so that the user experience is seamless, rather than this kind of clunky system switch thing? So I think that's just you want to be thinking about both.
It's always that tension. Yeah, you're always going to have the tension of, you know, doing one thing really well, doing many things okay, you know, like thinking about the organization's requirements for all of this versus the end user's experience of all of them. Like, there's not one that always wins out. I mean, I think we like to say that, like I said earlier, like, you want to, you know, say this is all about the user experience, but that's harder to kind of execute when you're thinking about a system. Like, it's just sort of, they're always in tension. And I think just embracing that tension is what I do as a designer, is really like finding my joy in the conflict.
Well, that is a good thing to find joy in, because the conflict exists a lot in this space. So just one final thought then that you want to leave people with, that will just help them to focus their efforts in the right place when it comes to improving the user experience of their HR tech. What's a final thought you'd leave people with?
I would say really embrace experimentation. I think, you know, give up on this idea that it's going to be done perfectly the first time. It's not. And kind of being able to finding the fun in that experiment, trying to sort of bring people into that conversation as participants rather than as sort of like people that you're subjecting something to. I think the more agility and the more experimentation you can bring in, the better, because it's what we've been talking about. It's tough. It's not like an easy thing to do. And so that's kind of the best way to stay light as you try different things out.
And I think if I were to build on that, I'd say, so everything that we've talked about today in terms of what you want to think through ahead of these decisions, the most important thing is actually get to the point where you're implementing something so that you've got real user experiences from which you can learn. Because I do think when talking about the user experience, it's important to register you can absolutely over-design, over-faff before you get on and do something. And there is you will build a better user experience if you start, because you'll know what it is. You'll learn something through it. So I would be a cheerleader for the experimentation cause as well. Elisa, thank you so much for your insights today. Let me just put up, these are our details. If anybody does want to contact us. One final thing to share just before people go is we have one last webinar in our series, which is going to be all about data and HR tech. We're going to be talking about how you take a data-led approach to building out your people experience, how you know if something you're doing to improve the people experience is actually working, what are some of the problems that are caused by having siloed data. So we've talked about these different products. They can often have different types of data in each of those different products. So what issues does that cause you? What's the data that you actually want from your systems? How can you get a more holistic perspective on your people and their behavior? And then finally, how that you make sure that the data that you have actually informs your decision making. I think sometimes we can get quite excited about the data that we've got, and then we actually don't. We're like, oh, this is really interesting what this tells us, but we don't actually do anything with it. We don't make a decision or try something different. So that's the final webinar in the series. It's in 2 weeks' time, same time as today, so Thursday, the 21st of July. Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much, Elisa. I've really, really enjoyed today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Bea.
We'll speak to you all soon.